Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. I'm Babak Ashrafi. Today is February 3rd, 2026, and I'm speaking with two people today. Courtney Thompson, thank you for joining us, Courtney.
Hi, good to be here.
And Kylie Smith, good to talk with you, Kylie.
Hi there.
Listeners may know Courtney from her first book, An Organ of Murder, Crime, Violence, and Phrenology in 19th Century America, and Kylie from her first book, Talking Therapy, Knowledge and Power in American Psychiatric Nursing. But today we're talking about a volume that Courtney and Kylie have edited together. It's called Do Less Harm, Ethical Questions for Health Historians, and is published by the Johns Hopkins University Press. Kylie, could you start by telling us what purpose this book is meant to serve? There's been a lot of work on ethical questions in the practice of health professionals. Why is it important for us to examine ethics for historians of health?
That is a really good question. I think that the main reason why it's important to think about history ethically in relation to the history of medicine and healthcare is because it hasn't really been done before. And I think that was really became obvious to us in our discussions that people were not thinking about whether we should be even doing things ethically and what would that mean, especially for historians. I think there's been a long period of historians thinking that they are above and beyond ethical questions, that somehow we go to archives and we mine this material and whatever is in the archives is ours for the taking. And I think, especially for me working in the history of psychiatry, I think that became a little bit of a contentious position, especially when we started to think about disability studies or MAD studies and this idea of who owns the records, right? So it really became a question of what are we doing with these really vital and important and personal pieces of information.
Courtney, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, as Kylie said, there's not been a lot written. I will recommend the work of Susan Lawrence, especially her book, Privacy in the Past, which remains one of the only substantial sort of works that really attended to questions of ethics for historians. And it was a real touchstone for us as we approach this project. But I also want to suggest that part of this book also was generated out of a frustration with this paucity and the fact that the very little attention that seemed to exist outside of Susan Lawrence's work tended to boil down to a few things that were very limited. Plagiarism being this major obsession, which is not unimportant, especially in the age of AI, but is not the be-all and end-all of ethical behavior for historians. And very little attention was paid to other kinds of ethical practices and behaviors. Sometimes there'd be attention to patient records in particular, especially a lot of Durmenstrang about HIPAA regulations. But of course, not all medical historians work in the US with its HIPAA regulations. Not all patient records or medical records are protected by HIPAA, even in the United States. And what's more, as we've discussed, as various authors discuss in our book, what's ethical is not simply what is legal. And patient records aren't the only ethical conundrum that historians of any variety face. So we really wanted to expand the attention to ethical questions beyond just the old staples of don't plagiarize and what to do with HIPAA. We really wanted to step well beyond those two topics, which seem to be the real main focus of the ethical attention that had existed up to this point, with, again, the exception of Susan Lawrence, who writes quite a bit about things like naming practices. But again, her focus is largely on patient records.
Courtney, could you tell us about how you went about trying to achieve those goals? How did you produce this volume?
Well, first of all, the goals came out of a different place. I don't think we ever set out to write this volume at all. As we observe in the introduction, we sort of give a history of how this book came to be. And it came to be largely because of the Consortium for the History of Medicine, as well as some very contextual things happening around the time that, as you mentioned, Kylie and both of our first books came out around the same time in 2020, 2021. As everybody knows, this was the era of COVID, everything shut down. And Kylie and I only just first met each other around that time. We were both in some presentations for the AHM of new books. And in these discussions, which were online at the time because of COVID, a lot of folks started to discuss these questions of ethics. And we decided to come to the consortium with a proposal to start a new working group for ethics and the history of medicine and human sciences. We never expected it would turn into a book. We kept a very sort of open communal approach where out of our conversations from reading different works, including Susan Lawrence, but also the works of bioethicists, disability advocates, Black feminists, lots of different kinds of scholars, archivists, librarians, as well as historians and activists. Over time, over the 2 years of the initial version of the working group, we collectively realized that what we really wanted to do was to write something. So the book, unlike a lot of other edited volumes, came from this very organic place of a community of people reading and learning together. We developed the idea of there even being a book together. The outline, the organization of the book was something that was largely communal. And while Kylie and I were the editors and resident cat herders of the group, it really was in many ways a very collaborative endeavor in a way that I personally found to be very satisfying, and that wouldn't have been possible without the structure of the working group and the support of the consortium.
Kylie, do you want to share your experience of producing the volume in the working group?
Yeah, I think during that COVID period, it was really hard to maintain an intellectual community. And so the consortium really did enable that. It allowed us also to reach out to people beyond our immediate circle. People, especially, it made gathering much more accessible for people who might not normally be able to get to conferences, for example. And that was a really great experience and a really great way to meet people of like mind and to really, I think the strength of it for us was that it wasn't a regular working group in terms of let's workshop someone's paper in progress, right? It was really a reading and discussion group. And that's really kind of what fed it for a long time was this, well, what has been written? What do we need to read? How can that reading then inform our own writing? And then it was really interesting to think about what we wanted to write, which was very much not a how to, right? Really very much about people's own experiences and their own goals as historians in one form or another.
Yes, and with the goal of the essays are very short, they're meant to be succinct and provocative. And we're really hoping, especially, that they'll be accessible to students, that this can be a text that, while it's not a textbook, can be a text that is very accessible to classes, because we really feel that ethical questions should be the foundation upon which all history is done, not just once you've been a historian for a few decades, you have the leisure to think about it. But no, this should be incorporated into methods classes for undergraduates and graduates, not something that they can think about later.
I remember that being a real topic of conversation, that we didn't have any training as historians. Ethics wasn't part of our training apart from this kind of idea of the institutional review board or an ethics committee, where we're very often told, well, you're not doing research, so you don't need to think about ethics, right? And so that became really obvious that there was a lack of thinking about what even ethics was in our training as historians.
So you have 24 contributions, and we can't go through all of them, but you've broken them up into topics. So Kylie, could you tell us what the section that concerns the historian is about?
Yeah, the different sections address different aspects of historical research and writing and teaching and reading. The historian section is really based on this idea of where are you in your journey as a historian, as your approach as a historian. So there are chapters in there that touched on issues that we engaged with in the working group, especially the idea of positionality. Baron Lerner's chapter, which is really about what does it mean to be who you are writing the type of history that you're writing. I think that comes from this kind of increasing recognition of the power relations inherent in the writing of history, especially in the history of medicine. A lot of the work in that section is influenced by the very particular circumstances of 2020, Black Lives Matter summer, all of that kind of stuff. And how do you write that sort of history, if you're not part of a particular community? And for me, it's always been really important because my second book is very much about the experience of Black patients in the psychiatric system in the South. And I am a white person, not from the South, right? So I was really very conscious about where am I in this story and how do I proceed ethically? How do I proceed to tell a story that really needs to be told, but isn't at the same time my story? And so my chapter is about this idea of reparatory history, and we read some work in that vein by David Scott and Catherine Hall, and they're influenced by the idea of reparations for slavery and how important history is to building a case for reparations. And part of my argument in that chapter is that there is a case to be made for reparations in the history of medicine and psychiatry in my case. So there's some really great chapters in there. I really love Rich McKay's chapter about really this moment where you have to face the fact that maybe you're not going to be able to write what you want to write if you don't have permission, right? And what that really means. And to be ready to do that, right? To be ready to say, actually, I don't have permission to write this, and so I'm not going to. And so, I think those chapters, Jess's chapter on being an activist at the same time, and Marco's chapter about dealing with these kinds of really personal motivations for why you do the history that you do, I think those are really important questions that historians are not often asked to think about, right? We just are like, I just write this topic because the archives fell on my head out of a cupboard, or, I did classics, or, whatever. But what we're trying to say is actually there are really personal reasons why you're involved in the work that you're doing.
Courtney, can you tell us about what your contributors discussed in the section on archives and museums?
I just want to take a step back real quick and mention that the structure of the book itself was something that we actually crowdsourced together. We had a Google Doc, and we sort of decided on these categories and then started to put sort of what our dream topics would be. And then those who were then members of the consortium sort of got first dibs. And then after that point, we sort of opened the door to see, well, what else do we want to see in here? What was on our dream list? And that's where we were able to bring in some other folks. So one of the people in this section, for example, was somebody we reached out to, Shelley Cigar, who has been involved in the process of helping to decolonize the Wellcome Collection, a very important collection in London, of course, and she has a really thoughtful piece on how do we encounter objects and what does it mean to really decolonize a museum. So the museums and archives, or archives and museums section, is one that I think really exemplifies the main theme of the book, which is to do less harm. That phrase itself sort of was a mantra that came out of our conversations, again, very organically. And we've actually had some pushback. The press didn't want us to call the book Do Less Harm. They thought that was limiting and maybe pessimistic. But part of our point is that it's an ongoing process. It's never a finished process. It's never possible to do no harm. But doing less harm is something we can all strive for. So we have experts in museums and archives in this section, for example, Melissa Graff and Amanda Mahoney, who talk about their attempts to do less harm in the exact institutions that they work in. How do you handle very sensitive materials? Amanda talks about a person's skull that was crafted into a container, possibly a candy dish. And what do you do with an object like that in a museum? Right? We also have some wonderful work in this piece in this section on disability from Kate Jurek. And disability is a very important thread that sort of winds its way through a lot of the chapters: disability access and disability justice. And Aparna Nair, who has written with Kylie before on this question, this problem of, well, what happens when you go on eBay and you can buy medical records, or for that matter, body parts? And how do we engage with this commerce in very intimate medical historical materials? And this is a section that really speaks to the stuff of history and the spaces where the kinds of materials we work with are preserved, How do we handle them? How do we encounter them? And how do we frame them for our publics?
Kylie, what kind of issues come up in the section on research?
So the research section actually includes Marco Ramos's chapter here, not in the historian section, as I mistakenly mentioned before. So I think that this section is really about addressing those core issues around what it means to do ethics in the research process as historians. And I think Marco's chapter really sticks out in my mind because he deals with this issue that I mentioned before about how we're so often dealt with at the institutional review board level, as historians, and how we sometimes think that because we don't have to get ethics approval, we don't need to think ethically. And so this section is really, really asking people to challenge that assumption that we have, and also to address things like silences in the archives or in research materials, which, we had a great time reading all of that really fantastic work about, reading against the grain and archival power, and how do you do research that is about really violent topics. Like sometimes the history of medicine is actually really violent. And so we were really, informed in our reading there and by Saidiya Hartman and thinking about how do you write histories of violence. And so the chapters really engage with some really great theoretical work that's already out there. How do you write history ethically when you have public sources like legal sources, like Lauren Thompson writes about as a legal medical historian? And just, I really think there's a lot in here about, again, that almost touches on issues of positionality again as well, the ethics of how we do the work that we do as historians of medicine in particular, right? There's something quite different about being a historian of medicine and healthcare that we think requires an ethical response.
Courtney, what kind of questions come up when it comes to writing?
So writing is one of those things that I think often offers some of the most concrete ethical questions. Do I use a patient's name or do I not? Do I cite this particular person or do I not? How do I review or peer review an article? How do I write for the public? And so this was a section that has 6 different essays that actually features 8 different authors. So we have 2 co-written essays in this particular section, and the authors deal with a lot of these sort of nitty-gritty of, well, once we've done the research, which is the research process is discussed in the previous section, well, how do we write about it? And this is another place where we saw some really great sort of old stalwarts of the group, people who were there from the beginning, like Claire Clark and Michaela Clark, no relation, writing respectively on diagnostic language and images. But we also reached out to some really wonderful scholars whose work we've been inspired by. Adria Amata, who's the author of the fantastic, is it Archive of Skin, Archive of Kin, or Archive of Kin, Archive of Skin? I can never remember which way around it is, but Adria Amata, who's the author of a fantastic book on Hansen's disease in Hawaii, a book that both Kylie and I really enjoyed. We invited her to write the chapter on names that I think is incredibly powerful. The series editor of the series that this book is published in with Hopkins Press actually came in to write a chapter for us on peer review and editing and the ethics thereof. And we also have some great work in here about writing for a digital audience, so digital health humanities as well, from Britt Dahlberg and Jessica Martucci, who very much are manifesting this particular moment, writing out of the COVID pandemic for the public.
Well, I think that Courtney should talk about her chapter.
My chapter in this section is on citation because I am a citation obsessive, as I tell my students when I teach methods. And I tried to actually write an essay on citation without any citations as an experiment. And then the press made me put citations in, which I'm still a little sad about because I had a vision. But it does engage with this question of, well, what do you cite bad people? How bad does a person have to be for you to not cite them? But then also, how do you engage in citational justice, which, to be clear, is not an idea that we have invented, but one where we learned a lot from, for example, the hashtag Cite Black Women movement. But thinking about these topics right now, as we speak in the first week of February 2026, yet more terrible people many academics have been found in more drops of the Epstein files. So I am thinking once again about how do we engage with bad actors, and at what point should we stop citing them? Yeah.
Big questions. And finally, Kylie, when it comes to teaching, how does this volume discuss teaching?
I think it was really important for us to make sure that we spoke to teaching. It would be really easy to focus on history as the practice thereof in terms of the creating of new knowledge, and then forget about the fact that at least half of our job is actually then translating that knowledge to people. So if we wanted to be serious about being ethical, then that had to be the whole gamut of the work that we do as historians. And so we were really lucky to have people part of the group who right from the beginning were thinking about the implications of ethical teaching. And obviously, again, this is an even more heightened question in 2026 than it was when we were putting this section together and talking about these issues. But there are really great contributions in this section about how do you teach difficult topics. The history of medicine is sometimes unpleasant and it can be squeamish, and there are bodily things to talk about. And how do you create a safe space in the classroom to talk about that? And how do you actually push students out of their comfort zone, right? How do you teach in a collaborative way, using communities, centering the voices of the people that you're actually writing about, so you're not recreating marginalization and victimization? How do you work with institutions, sometimes who are problematic ethically in their own way? How do you deal, again, there's a section in here, a chapter in here by Beatrix about how you actually teach with images. So there's a section earlier about researching images and using images in your research, but this great chapter about how you teach with them in ways that are, again, upholding of the dignity and the privacy of the people, but don't let students get away with not looking, right? And so, and then I think we were really kind of conscious too of the fact that, as we started, we were all conscious of the fact that we did not have ethical training in our own graduate school careers. So there's Shannon's chapter is really about that, and how you then get your own graduate students who are going to be future historians to think ethically. And also, most of us actually teach students who are going on to be healthcare providers of some kind, not necessarily historians. And so that also raised really different types of questions for teaching.
Courtney, did you want to say more about teaching?
I did just want to make sure to say a few things about the back matter, which I feel like never gets enough attention in books. But in addition to the wonderful conclusion that was written by Susan Reverby, which is a really fantastic look at her own journey through this question of ethics as she's worked on very challenging topics, like, as we all know, her work on the Tuskegee syphilis study. We also collaboratively put together two different appendices that are a little atypical for, I think, most volumes. So Appendix A is ethical questions, not a sort of checklist. And as we say in the introduction, we are offering questions, not answers, mostly in this book. But we asked every single author to contribute at least one question for other historians to think with. And in addition, we have a second appendix, which is not a bibliography. It is instead a list of recommended readings. And again, we asked every author to suggest at least two readings that could be from any field, but that have helped them to think about the ethical challenges they faced. And we combined these with the readings from our various working group meetings. So we see these as a pretty useful starting point, a very eclectic starting point for people who are thinking about, how do I approach ethics? And one thing I really appreciate about our second appendix, Appendix B, is that it isn't a bibliography. It does not represent everything that was cited in the volume. And it's not just about history of medicine. There's a lot of works from very different fields here, but it gives a sense of how many different people are out there thinking about these questions that we can learn from in an interdisciplinary and open fashion, which frankly, I think not just our field, but a lot of fields could do a lot more with.
So we've reviewed the sections of the book, and I think, Courtney, you've already said twice that this is not a textbook on ethics and the history of medicine. So why not? How do you hope people will use it, and why is it not a textbook on how to do history of medicine ethically?
That's a great question. I think it's not a textbook because, well, first of all, we don't intend it purely for classroom use. We think that ethics has been understudied and underconsidered by a lot of historians, partially just from sheer inertia. As Kylie referenced earlier, a common talking point was how very little attention or discussion or training all of us received in ethics and ethical questions, as well as more generally, and we've also noticed this somewhat in the reception of the book, a kind of dismissiveness to the idea that historians even need to consider ethical concerns or should be worried about ethics, or for that matter, that history of medicine requires extra attention to the ethics of the practice. We're very much hoping that, while on the one hand, we really would love to see this baked into the ground level introductions to history of medicine and history more generally for lots of students, undergraduates and graduates alike. At the same time, there's a lot of historians at every level, up to the most senior, who could really do with some reflection, some humility, and some self-evaluation about the choices they make every day and the choices they've made in the past and how they could perhaps do less harm. And I've acknowledged this, and I started by saying that, or one of the first things I said in my introduction is that to a certain extent that talk was an apologia for things I know I have done in the past as a historian that I now feel rather embarrassed about, ashamed even. I can look at many examples from either my research or from my teaching where now, with the perspective and the additional training and the way I've been thinking about ethics, I can see the ways I can be better and I can do better in the future. And I think that, I'm not going to say that I'm any paragon of virtue, but I think that it's actually a very healthy process to take a really hard look at the things that you take for granted and the assumptions that you bake into all aspects of your research. And ethics should be one of them, right? How can we do better? And yes, that might lead to some very uncomfortable conversations within the field, or for that matter, that we have with ourselves about maybe there's some research out there that shouldn't be. Maybe there's some sources that we shouldn't use or that we should only use in very particular ways. Maybe we do need to rethink that course that we've been teaching the same way for 25 years. And these are not thoughts that a lot of historians want to think. And in general, it's a field, not history of medicine, but history as a whole. We are kind of ironically very bad at historicizing ourselves. You know, we talk a good game about historiography, but we're not often very critical of our own work. And I think that this book, the reason why we're asking questions is because we don't want to provide guidelines. We don't want to provide regulations or rules. Part of our point is that these are constantly changing. A really good example is the language around slavery. So the language used to describe people in slavery has changed a great deal since when I was in grad school, since I was in college, in 40 years and 50 years. So there's always going to be moving goalposts. It's impossible to say this is the rule and then let's stick with it. We think it's much more productive to encourage people to ask questions of themselves, of others, of their courses, of their readings, with the idea, once again, of there's never going to be a possibility of doing absolutely no harm. We don't even know what kinds of harms we'll be talking about or what ethical prerogatives we'll be talking about in 20, 50, 100 years. But by asking the questions, by forcing yourself to think about these things and confront them and engage them and discuss with your colleagues, that we think is the foundation to good ethical practice. Not getting it right, but not pretending that it's not an issue for you.
Kylie, did you want to add something?
I think it's really telling to think about some of the response we've had to the book. I think I was thinking this morning about what a turning point the social history move was, right? And how, in a way, that was also an ethical turn, right? This realization that history couldn't and shouldn't continue to be written from the top down, right? This idea that history could be written from the bottom up. And I know that there was a lot of pushback at that time. And so I don't necessarily think that we are like on a par with the social history movement, but I do think we're asking for a continued turn, right? Like maybe social history in and of itself is not enough. And Susan Reverby talks about that in her conclusion about where they were coming from at that time and how this book asks historians to do more again, right? To think again about what it is that we're doing and our right to do it. And it was really interesting recently to talk about the book and have people, senior scholars say, what are you doing? Like, you're just thinking about it too much. And if we sit here and navel gaze like this, maybe you're telling us that we won't be able to do history at all. We were just like, maybe, like, like, we're not saying don't do history, but if you think that there is a problem with what you're doing, then maybe stop and think about that, right? And so we also have had a fair bit of pressure to come up with a guideline and to come up with answers, like what should we do then? And we've had to continually reiterate, well, we don't have an answer. The whole book is not an answer. The whole book is very deliberately a set of questions.
So not only are we approaching the 250th anniversary, not only are we a few years past COVID, but we're a little more than a year past the 2024 election. So I wonder if you could reflect how the changes in higher education since that election have changed the contemporary relevance of this volume.
As Courtney said, I think the ethical imperative that undergirds the whole book is even more important now. I am very conscious of the fact, again, that we only 2 years ago, again, when we got feedback on the volume, there was a question about, are you saying then that the only ethical way to do history is for history questions to be about questions of justice? And we didn't necessarily mean that to be what we were arguing, but it just came out that way in a lot of the essays that people have written. And now I would actually answer that question in the very affirmative, like, absolutely yes. Yeah, absolutely. If you are not writing history right now, especially in the history of medicine and the history of healthcare, that is related to current issues of injustice, of lies, of putting people's health in jeopardy, then I'm really not sure what you're doing. People say, oh, history shouldn't be political, and I'm like, oh, I don't know what planet you've been on, but history's always been political. And if you're not being political right now, I'm at a kind of a loss, really, as you can tell by my stumbling over words. But also, I think about what is coming down the line and what some people are already experiencing, which is very active censorship in the classroom, right? Like, we know the truth, historically speaking. I don't mean that we know all truths for all time, but when it comes to what causes health disparities, what caused people of color to die more frequently during COVID, we know historically why that is an issue, right? And it is more and more important that we stick to that truth and we hold firm on that line. But at the same time, I know that's a real struggle for people. I was in the fortunate position of being able to leave the country. I just would not be a part of a system that wanted to tell my students lies.
Well, I am not fortunate enough to be able to leave the country, or even the South. I'm speaking here from Mississippi, where in the past year there have been a lot of changes on my campus and a certain chilling of speech around, and changes made in the curriculum, for example, to undo the work of gender scholars, scholars of race, It's not just affecting the fields you might think. I see it spreading in really interesting ways across what is effectively, I'm at an ag school, and there's some really interesting ways that the political landscape has reshaped lots of aspects of academia and teaching. That is largely a story for a different day, but it has made me think a lot about this year. I've been thinking a lot about what are my red lines and what are my moral responsibilities, my ethical responsibilities to myself, to my colleagues, to my university, to my country, and most importantly, I think to my students. As Kylie said, justice was an important theme in our book. We talk about it in the introduction. It comes up at various points from different authors. And that was, again, something that emerged very organically from our collaborative discussions. I think at least in part because the group was founded on the sort of foundation of the political moment of COVID and Black Lives Matter. And that shaped what a lot of us were bringing to the table. I'm not sure that I'm all the way there with what Kylie said. To a certain extent, maybe because I'm working on stuff that doesn't always feel so relevant to justice. And I do think that there's a place for kinds of history that do not necessarily have a very clear or immediate relevance to the, like, I think we have to make space for all kinds of historians. And I do think that's important. However, I will say that I think the last few years have profoundly radicalized me. But I also think that one thing I've learned, especially being where I am in this historic moment, is that the most radical thing I can do from my positionality is simply tell the truth and be in a classroom and teach students about things that they would not be exposed to if I were not there. And it's a quiet kind of radicalism, but I think it's an essential one. And I think that that's my where a lot of my sense of the ethical imperative comes from, that there is a kind of truth-telling and interpretation that has to continue even when they're stripping the names off of programs and changing descriptions and telling you can't hire somebody with, you can't have a search for somebody who works on slavery because slavery is now a word we're not allowed to use in the Deep South. So I believe that now more than ever, we must be thinking about the ethical dimensions of every aspect that we do. And more than that, and what I hope that the structure of the book demonstrates, is that historians are not just historians in their ivory tower. It's not just what we choose to research and how we write about it and where we publish it. It really matters how we speak to publics. It matters how we act in administrative roles, which is another thing that we should probably talk more about. It matters how we talk to our students. And honestly, it matters how we talk to our nearest and dearest, our friends and family, who sometimes look to us, not as much as they should, but who look to us to interpret some of these things that are happening around us. And I'm hoping that this book starts, and I don't want to speak for Kylie, but my hope is that this book starts a real conversation among historians about who we are responsible to, what our ethical responsibilities are, how we look both to the past and to the present, and hopefully to the future, by grounding ourselves in these ethical questions and looking beyond the sort of self-centered concerns about, oh no, plagiarism, which again, plagiarism is still bad, but what are our other ethical obligations to the field, to history itself in the abstract, to our patients, to our publics, to descendants, and to ourselves? And if all we can do is encourage people to ask these questions, the fact that they're particularly salient right now gives me maybe not a lot of hope about the present, but it does give me a lot of hope about how historians can continue to tell the truth and be quietly radical in all of these spaces.
Good. Well, thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Kylie, for sharing your work and the work of your collaborators with us. The volume is Do Less Harm, Ethical Questions for Health Historians, from the Johns Hopkins University Press. Listeners can find more resources for exploring this topic as well as others at www.chstm.org. This has been a podcast from the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine.